Warning, this review will contain spoilers, and if you haven't seen the episode in the last 4 days and decide to go past this point, it's your own fault, so don't get mad at me.
Yay!
Season 7 is now upon us, which means we have new episodes to review. Will the season start off highly or crash and burn? All will be revealed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pones N Stuff. Before we start, if you're new to the CC Network or didn't check out the blog reviews last season, you'll need to be aware of the rating criteria. Each episode is rated out of 5 for the quality of its story and narrative, writing and voice acting, animation, message, i.e. the friendship lesson or moral of the episode as outlined by the MLP wiki, and the music. All 5 individual ratings combine to give a total score out of 25, which is assigned a letter grade from A+ to F. For me, an average episode would score a C, which in the number equivalent is 13 out of 25, so anything higher or lower will attain the appropriate love or contempt that I believe it deserves. You understand that? Good. Without further ado, let's take a look at Celestial Advice. With any season premiere, you can understand why there would be trepidation amongst all the excitement. What could happen? Would it be executed effectively? Will it be satisfying even? That was a series of questions that I was hoping would be answered by the first episode of this unusual two-parter. Thankfully, with this continuing directly after the season 6 finale, my fears were put slightly at ease. I'm a sucker for this show acknowledging its continuity, and for the writers to use that to show they didn't need to write a new story from scratch was a welcome start, as it meant the episode could remain grounded and open, which also highlighted the ability to align this tense award ceremony with enough funny cringe comedy to make it grasp on all of the emotional spectrum, making it a premiere-worthy event. However, once that ceremony ended, this episode started to show how empty it was, with its main continuity goal now achieved, relying on discord in an out-of-place moment to shoehorn a conflict into proceedings and ensure that this slow, turgid pace that had come through already was combined with a tense atmosphere that was never given a chance to shift, making its middle act something that I actually ended up watching with contempt rather than pleasure. This meant that the awkward comedy would generate even more tension, which would grate even more on the brain and create a jarring mood and atmosphere. But thankfully, that impact was lessened by one Princess Celestia showing her true colours. While I could easily praise this episode for Twilight and Starlight's personal growth, which I'm now acknowledging, this episode belonged to Princess Moonbutt, giving her the free rein to showcase her emotional depth. From acknowledging that she had no idea that her name was used as an expression, to her gut-busting laugh, to her most stressed and most tender moments. It allowed the most powerful of gods to come across as humble and down-to-earth, ensuring that Starlight and Twilight's growth got accentuated by us seeing a mysterious character on show for all to see, in a substantial element of development the likes of which we haven't seen for some time on this show. And with the help of flashbacks and fantasies getting things moving, and with some great animation and continuity on show, it alleviated the pressure on the pace and the story, which when buffed by a strong message regarding anxiety, coming of age, and looking after your friend's best interests, it gave this episode some real emotive weight, which when accented by the climax made it hit even more, allowing Starlight to stick around for the good of this series' progression. However, if you strip back all of these positive aspects, including a fantastic vocal performance by Tara Strong, which made Twilight's outbursts quite entertaining indeed, this episode is still full of issues. I'm fully aware that the fantasy scenes I've mentioned have already been praised for their part in helping the story flow and giving a visual spark to a quite lifeless episode up until this point, but it served a reminder of how empty the whole premise was, in the idea that, okay, it's inside the castle for its majority, we need to liven things up. They felt shoehorned and forced, padding out everything, including a dialogue that could have easily been done without it, but we wouldn't have had an exciting episode without them, would we? And when you think about that they were coupled with Twilight's own dialogue that she thought up in her brain in these scenes, it cranked the already awkward tension up to 11, which made them even more difficult to watch and slowed the pace even more. However, I will say the Starlight Ember bro-tastic moment was hilarious, although to say. Outside of those scenes though, within the fantasies, the animation category barely got much of a chance to showcase itself outside of Discord's usual fashion montage. And musically, Will Anderson's score accented scenes but did very little to appeal to the ears and be exciting of any note, allowing the characters and limited visuals to attempt to do the same, but with lackluster results coming from it. We also had an ensemble cast of characters who could have easily played a role in livening this episode up, but were left to squander themselves in very limited roles, much to my displeasure. And to cap it all off, the episode ended in a really irritating way, especially from my end as an editor myself, fading to black and then cutting harshly back to Pinky clearing up the party. It was too harsh, and in a move I'm rarely in a position to do, I will criticise the editor who cut that for not having the characters themselves cross-dissolve out of the hall, leaving it empty, which would have been a much smoother transition. Regardless though, it was a great visual metaphor for how I felt about the episode overall. While I was happy that this episode started out by addressing the immediate concerns its predecessor left behind, as it went on I was left disappointed despite the great emotional weight it gave. It was an episode of importance for sure, but it was let down at its foundations to where this important moment of progression was overshadowed by what was left in its wake. For continuity, character growth and message, this episode fulfilled its desired objective in making it feel worthy of a premiere starter, but when looking at its writing, story and narrative construction, music and animation, it didn't give itself enough to make it stand out for the position it holds, and with its mood and atmosphere of unease and tempestuousness that never shifted, it was a very uncomfortable thing to sit through, ensuring that all the negatives were amplified tenfold, especially with a jarring shift in plot not helping proceedings. The characters and scenarios we saw were rewarding, but sitting through a lot to get to them highlighted the bumpy road this episode had to take to get to its eventual goal. It was a risk worth starting out with, but honestly they tried to do work with so little, but ultimately I can't say I'm too pleased with what was done in what was still an enjoyable episode, but for a premiere, it just wasn't good enough overall to escape negative equity. Overall, Celestial Advice scored a total of 10 out of 25, which is a D+. As you can see, it hasn't been the best start to proceedings, but we still have another episode to get through, so it's time to see if All Bottled Up can better its disappointing brethren. Following on from Celestial Advice was going to be a tough order, but based on what we got, it seemed like it was an easy transition. I say this because we went from one episode with a downcast and downtrodden mood into one that was full of brightness and laughter to be had. And you can believe that happened when we had Starlight and Trixie at the helm. Both mayors supported each other in the writing department thanks to their contrasting personalities, one being sassy, confident and unsympathetic, while the other was stern, overly anxious and frustrated. Both characters as a result through their dialogue not only played off each other with incredible ease, they also took shot at this show's form and function, even foreshadowing that the main six would actually go out and perform a song. Which they did, much to my happiness. And with every interaction and every moment, these two had me in tears at the sheer gall of one character and the frustration of the other, as they had a negative mood to contrast well with the main six's overly saccharine team-building exercise. And that subplot could have easily been a little too much for the episode to balance, but by focusing the smallest but essential amount of time needed, it propped up the episode and made it seem full and lively. We were also given a varied and playful soundtrack that enhanced scenes and brought some real spunk out of an episode that could have flunked otherwise. The story of both characters ironing out their friendship kinks, developing in the process and showing great depth, went at a steady enough pace with enough visual flourish peppered throughout where nothing ever got stale or boring, which is saying something unlike its predecessor on this Saturday morn, as it utilised every single character involved in it to good effect without lessening what the story was trying to tell. And it all did so with some good vocal performances throughout. Everything that this episode did seemed pretty good on the whole. I may be praising this episode a little too much, but when you're enjoying yourself as much as I was watching, and you realise that this with a simple premise is executing it so well, and making me laugh out loud in the process, I really can't find too much to complain about. But knowing me, I always manage to do so, because nothing I ever look at is universally perfect. So, let's see what my critical brush has turned up, first of all, by looking at the musical number. I hated Best Friends until the end of time when the episode first aired, finding it to be cheesy and very artificial, something that Dan Engram's work on this show hasn't reflected outside of Equestria Girls 1. However, upon closer inspection, it was a sublime piece of composition and catchiness that got better with every single subsequent listen, where I couldn't stop putting a smile on my face. It's almost an anthem for this franchise, so to speak, even if Twilight's lyrics are arguably the most cringeworthy lines put into an MLP song outside of that first Equestria Girls film, but that still didn't stop me from enjoying this bouncy dance pop number. Then again, the fact it was foreshadowed helped it immensely. It also contained the equivalent of animation LSD, being full of so many amazing elements that my eyes were in awe, making the musical aspect almost not matter in the long run. But while there was a share of good character designs, angry magic clouds, and a teacup poodle for God's sake on display in this episode, to have such a large concentrated animation elements in one part of the episode, i.e. this song, meant it wasn't as spread out as it could have been, making it feel very lopsided as a whole. Then we get to the message, which was recycled from PPOV last season, but unlike its season 6 predecessor, this episode utilised its entire runtime to build its themes of communication and arguments in a much smoother way, building steadily and having its conflict come to pass in a creative way, while leaving enough room for it to be resolved in a touching and more profound way than PPOV ever did. It allowed Trixie and Starlight to showcase what they'd learned without it feeling protracted, purposeless, or patronising, making this episode feel like it had pretty much done everything right, even when not everything went to plan. And with that, I can't really say much more. This episode was a blast to sit through. They ironed out the major kinks that made No Second Prances so disappointing, and created an episode that was thrilling, funny and intriguing, and that built on the foundations that were laid before it. Everything this episode tried to do worked, and it created such an entertaining experience that not even the issues of a recycled message, cheesy musical number lyrics, and a disproportionate spread of animated elements couldn't do enough to stop the praise from flowing. After such a flat opener before it, the writers opened up a can of whoop-ass and showed what can happen when a story, writing, animation, music and message combo can accomplish if they work together to create a complete overall viewing experience. This was for me one of the most joyful experiences I've had watching this show, and it did it without breaking a sweat. Now this is the type of episode I've come to expect from a premiere. I'm happy to see on one end of the 2-episode bargain, this episode has done what the other couldn't do, making such a complete episode so enjoyable to the point where not many in this show's run, in my opinion, can match it. Overall, All Bottled Up scored a total of 23 out of 25, which is an A, which means it slides into my top 10 favourite episodes of all time on this show with apparent ease. I said after last season's finale to Where I'm Back Again, where it broke all the conventions, that no premiere or finale would ever be the same again. I was right to a degree. I mean, we've got 2 individual episodes instead of one whole 2-parter, so that's something. When you look at what both of these episodes did, emotional moments, big musical number, continuities to the plot, you know, in a way they start ticking off the trope boxes, so in a way, not much has really changed, and whether you take that as a good or a bad thing is entirely up to you. However though, when you look at these 2 episodes individually, the episode may have started off on a bit of a bumpy, rocky, uneven footing, but when you look at what All Bottled Up managed to do, I can be very pleased that Season 7 has started in a very positive way. We just have to hope now that that momentum can keep going into next week's episode, and that will be very intriguing to judge. I have been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching. This has been the first ever episode of Pones N Stuff for the CC Network, and I will see you all next time.